Well, being described as a know-it-all or a smart aleck is a bit of a backhanded compliment. On the one hand, you might be pleased that people deem you intelligent, but on the other hand, it kind of implies a lack of concern that you don't really care about other people or who gets in your way in order to prove your point. And that's really the issue that the Apostle Paul takes up in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. This kind of begins a new literary section in the book of 1 Corinthians, and at this point the Apostle Paul is answering some more of the questions that the Corinthians had asked him in their previous letter. And the question that's really on their mind at this point of 1 Corinthians is this: what should we do about food that's already been offered to idols? Should we eat it, or should we abstain from it? Now, for you and I, that's a very alien concept. It's not really an issue that we face today. But for the Corinthians, that's a very real and live issue. As they were buying food and meat at the markets, quite often that meat had already been dedicated to false gods and idols. And so the Corinthians were kind of divided on this issue, split into two camps. Some of them were saying, it's fine, just eat the meat, it's no big deal. But others were deeply concerned and felt defiled by it and thought they should absolutely abstain from it. And so the Apostle Paul, over the next 3 days, really says three different things on this issue. The first of which we're going to look at this morning, and it's this: love is greater than knowledge. Love is greater than knowledge. Look at verse 1 of chapter 8. It says, "Now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up." The Apostle Paul hasn't even started giving a firm yes or no answer as to whether or not it's okay for them to eat the meat. Rather, before he does that, he wants to give a bit of a gentle rebuke to some of these Corinthians. You might remember the importance that the Corinthians placed on knowledge. That's why earlier on in 1 Corinthians we saw how they worshipped people who had particular knowledge, those orators who spoke very fluently and eloquently. The Corinthians found themselves worshipping them. They thought knowledge was great. And it appears when it comes to this issue, some of the Corinthians who maybe had some strong theological knowledge were kind of bulldozing all the others with their opinions. They were kind of able to lay out their 5-point theological argument as to why it's okay that we eat this meat. And the Apostle Paul wants to say, hold on a second. Some of your brothers, some of the other Corinthians, they're deeply disturbed about this. They've got a very sensitive conscience. Meanwhile, you just come in bulldozing with your theological arguments without really any care or concern about how they feel defiled and sensitive about this issue. And so the Apostle Paul says, hold on a second, your knowledge is actually knowledge without love, and that sort of knowledge, the Apostle Paul says here in verse 1, is just knowledge that puffs up. This phrase, puffing up, is one that comes up time and time again in 1 Corinthians, and it really shows the extent of the problem of pride and arrogance among the Corinthians. And so the Apostle Paul says, hold on a second, you might have your neat theological arguments down to a T, but you're actually lacking love for your Corinthian brothers and sisters who feel very sensitively about this issue. And so notice what Paul says in verse 2. He kind of points out an irony to those who think that they know a lot. He says this: if anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. Paul says, here's the irony. You think that you know a lot, but the fact that you think you know everything proves that you don't really know everything. Because here's a principle which is true about life, some which you can attest to. The more you know about something, the more you discover you don't really know. You might have experienced that as you went to university or you took your subject to further study. You learn more and more and more about the subject, but the more you learn, the more you discover there is that you don't really know. The more you know, the more you discover you don't really know. And that's what the Apostle Paul says here. If you really had true knowledge, you would know that there's so much stuff you don't really know. You claim to know a lot about the Bible, well then you would know that the Bible says be humble and be kind and be gracious to your brother and sister, and that's exactly what you're not doing. So Paul shows the irony to some of these Corinthians about the claims that they make compared to the life that they live. Rather, there's something which is so much more important, Paul says in verse 3. It's not ultimately what about you know, but what God knows, or who God knows. Look at verse 3. It says this: but if anyone loves God, he is known by God. You see, the chief issue isn't about what you know. The chief issue is who God knows. The chief issue isn't what you know about God, but what God knows about you. The Apostle Paul says what ultimately matters is that God knows you, that you are one of His children. And if you're one of His children, Paul says in verse 3, then you will love God and by extension, love others. And so here's your challenge for today. The Bible here is not saying quite clearly that knowledge is not important. That's not what the Bible's saying. That would go entirely against the grain of the New Testament's teaching. It's through our knowledge of the truth that we are led to godliness. Paul tells us later in Titus chapter 1. Rather, what Paul's teaching here is this: knowledge apart from love is meaningless. Knowledge apart from love just merely puffs us up. And so I wonder where in your life are you tempted to obtain more knowledge apart from love? Do you ever find yourself reading the Bible just to expand your theological knowledge? Do you ever find yourself spouting out Bible verses to someone else, not as a means of encouraging them or even lovingly rebuking them, but just to point score and win an argument? The Apostle Paul says, don't do that. To do that is just to show or flout knowledge without love, and all that does is puff up. Rather, ensure that you're known by God, which in response will lead you to love Him and love others and have all your knowledge accompanied with love. Hope you have a great day.